No bill passed by Parliament as initiated by government, which is the party that controls the majority in Parliament, can become law until the Queen signs that bill. And that's known as providing her royal assent to a piece of law. And only then, once the Queen assents to that piece of legislation, does it become law in this country. Now, that's all fair and well, hunky-dory. It's been working nicely for 300 years based upon, you may be surprised to hear this, it's been working well for 300 years based upon what can only be described as a gentleman's agreement. Everybody shook hands and said, this is how we're going to function now. And everybody dare not question the fact that this is held together by a gentleman's agreement. Theoretically, now, this is where, of course, it won't happen, but theoretically, the Queen could at any given moment decide not to sign a piece of legislation, even if the government wanted her to. She could say, well, I don't agree with that. Now, of course, the reason she's survived so long, the reason the monarchy has survived so long, is because the monarchy knows that to do so would pretty much bode the end of the monarchy. Because there would be uprising and Parliament would seize control. And, that would be known as a constitutional crisis. Where the dust settles in such a scenario, people dare not think. However, it's never happened. And the reason it's never happened is the same reason why the Queen is still Queen, because nobody wants to test the waters in this regard. And the fact we have an unwritten constitution makes it even more scarier for the prospect to think of what would happen if the Queen suddenly decided to withhold her royal assent. Now, prior to Brexit, we could also be forgiven for being unable of thinking of a scenario in which it could happen that ministers advise the Queen not to sign off on a bill that's come before her. We'd be forgiven for being unable to think of a scenario where that situation could occur because, of course, it's almost an oxymoron, because by definition, the party that forms government has a majority in the House of Parliament. And so you couldn't think of a scenario where the party that has the majority ends up having a bill passed against their wishes. Because, think about it, they have the majority. They could vote any bill down if they didn't want it. So you'd be forgiven for not being able to think of a scenario up until now where a bill would be presented before the Queen and the government officially advises the Queen not to sign it. However, now, these are peculiar times. Suddenly that scenario becomes plausible. How so? Well, because Theresa May is Prime Minister, and it just so happens that even though she controls the majority in Parliament, the majority of her MPs don't necessarily agree on what she wants to do with Brexit. And so on any one given topic, not least the topic of Brexit, the majority of Parliament could vote against the will of government, including her own MPs rebelling against her whip, not listening to the instructions provided to them by the government that they have to vote in accordance with the government's wishes. And so take Theresa May's deal. Theresa May's Brexit deal is unfathomably unpopular. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes it. And so it keeps getting voted down, though it's a government bill. It keeps getting rejected in the House of Commons for 3 times now. It's been resoundingly rejected. Now, imagine this scenario. For that to happen, for her bill to be rejected in such a way, it means her own MPs are voting against her because her party does have the majority in Parliament. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to form government. So her own MPs are voting against her own bill. Now, imagine this. Those same MPs sided with the opposition. Imagine this hypothetical scenario. If those same rebel MPs who are voting against Theresa May's Brexit deal sided with the opposition and with all the other parties that aren't in government, and imagine that became a majority. Not hard to imagine in the current situation because, of course, they keep voting against the government's bill and her own rebels are making the majority tip the other way. So if they introduced a piece of legislation that was now against the wishes of the government and got it passed through Parliament by siding with the opposition benches, that kind of legislation could be, for example, wanting to control the legislative order of the bills that are put before Parliament, wanting to, for example, prohibit the prospect of a no deal scenario. There is already an indicative vote in Parliament that indicates that a majority of MPs would vote against a no deal scenario. So imagine somebody, a backbencher, put forward a bill saying we will now ban a no deal scenario. Imagine Theresa May's government tried to oppose that bill, but her rebel MPs sided with the opposition, and imagine it was to be found that there's a majority in Parliament Parliament that now votes for banning a no-deal scenario. Imagine that bill now, of course, as it has to do, goes before the Queen for royal assent. Imagine then that Theresa May, in a final attempt to demonstrate that she's in control, take back control, decides to instruct her ministers, her loyal ministers, to advise the Queen not to sign that bill. Whoa, now that's dangerous. So that is ministers advising the Queen not to provide her royal assent to a piece of legislation that the majority of the House of Commons has voted for. That has never happened for 300 years. It's known as a constitutional crisis, and yet it's precisely what is being talked about could happen right now.